Good morning. This is the Blaine's World webcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You get more information about this show and past shows at our website, which is behind me, blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, in my Zoom studio here in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the most positive guys I know, and he is Bob Arleigh. Is that pronouncing?
Yeah,
Ar
you did great. You're doing
okay,
great.
Bob Arleigh. And so wait, I should get it. So that's your now stage name, Bob Arleigh.
And that's my real name.
But what's the white
You know,
term?
that's funny. It's funny that you should ask. Robert Arley White. That's my name. When I lived in Jacksonville, there were, I don't know, six or seven really visible Bob Whites. You couldn't
Okay.
throw a rock and not hit a Bob White. There was a guy that ran the Omni Hotel. There was the guy that was the president of Compass Bank. There was a guy that ran an insurance company. There was a policeman that walked a beat downtown. There were all of these Bob Whites. And my joke was that they were getting blamed for things that I did, and I never got, they always got the credit for things that I was doing. So I started using my full name when I lived in Jacksonville. One of the really liberating things about moving to Asheville, North Carolina was I got to be Bob White again. And but Robert Arley White is it's a unique name. It's a special name for a whole lot of reasons. And it just helps people to find me in the vast sea of Bob Whites that exist in the world.
Brilliant. Thanks for being my guest. Also, you can wave
Thank
to
you for
all,
having me. It's a delight to see you again.
and you can wave to all your fans and friends and other Bob Whites who are watching this. So,
Hey, everybody.
okay. Anyway, I should mention that Bob has enjoyed a dynamic career as an arts leader in as a civil rights advocate in Jacksonville, Florida, many years before coming to Asheville. He continues to work as a storyteller and consultant to individuals and nonprofit organizations, especially in the development area. And so the question, Bob, I always ask, and I think I asked you the first time I had the pleasure of interviewing you, is as a kid you grew up where again?
That's a loaded question. My dad had an amazing career in the military.
Oh, okay.
We grew up all over the planet. And in fact, that's such a good question, Blaine, because it is germane to the whole Robert Arley White thing. My dad worked very directly for Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was the commander in chief of naval forces both during World War II and during the Korean War. And Admiral Burke was a mentor to my father. He's a very, very important person. In fact, they had a nickname for him. They called him 31 Knot Bert because at the time he was able to get ships to move faster than anybody had ever seen them move before on the sheer force of his will. So when my parents gave me his name as my middle name, that's quite a legacy. It's quite something to live up to. But Blaine, I started off outside of Washington, D.C. From there, we went to Naples, Italy. From there, we went to Lenore, North Carolina, back to Washington, D.C., Oslo, Norway, Winter Park, Florida, Washington, D.C. again, Honolulu, Hawaii, and then Mayport, which is the one of the Navy bases right outside of Jacksonville. And then from there, I went to school in Oklahoma for a bit, and then back to Jacksonville, where I lived for the next 40 years of my life. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm from Jacksonville.
Oh, so when you were from Jacksonville or all these other places, you always know as a kid you wanted to be working in all the things you do, working in two things with nonprofits, and then also did you know as a kid you wanted to be a storyteller?
Well, right. And in fact, I think most of my work with nonprofits in particular, and with individuals too, has been on how do you tell a compelling story in a way that raises awareness or visibility or funding or is attractive to potential board members. I think at the end of the day, the thing that we're left with is a story. And most of us want ours to be a really good one. And so it's been one of the pleasures of my life to work with a host of different nonprofits in a variety of different spaces to tell stories that mattered to the people that they served and also to the people who supported that work.
You remember the first nonprofit you ever worked with?
The first nonprofit that I ever worked with that wasn't a theater
Right.
organization or arts organization was a felon reentry program in Jacksonville, and it was called Operation New Hope. And that fella, that the fella that started that was a contractor, and he was working on some construction in a rough part of town, and and what happened was he people were reluctant to do work in that part of town. So he got a hold of a big rig and he said, come on, bring all your tools, all your equipment, all that stuff. We'll just lock it up in the big rig and it'll be safe there. Well, don't you know, somebody stole the whole rig and it broke his heart. And so he went to one of the preachers in the neighborhood and he said, I don't know what to do. This is very frustrating. And the preacher said, when you go around, you see a lot of people, especially men, who are unemployed, and it would probably make a difference to your work if you were able to employ them in a way that was mutually beneficial. So what he did was he hired some of these guys right off the street to guard the equipment that built the buildings. And beyond a certain period of time, if they were successful, then he arranged for them to have training so that they could actually have jobs building the buildings and doing that kind of thing. And it really took off. He was cited by, I know, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama. A number of people have recognized it's just a really outstanding model that has made a real difference in that neighborhood and by extension, throughout neighborhoods across the country. That was really exciting work. Another really important nonprofit that I worked with was a group called See the Girl, and that is an organization that focuses primarily on trafficked girls or girls who are at high risk of being trafficked. And the way that came to be, the director was visiting well, it was a prison essentially, but it was girls. And she asked these young ladies what was it they really wanted. And one of the very young girls, I think she said she was all of 12 years old and skinny and scared and all of that. She said, I want people to see me. I'm just not some girl that got into trouble. I'm so much more than that. And that really went to the heart of the director. And so she put together it's an institute actually, See the Girl. And that's the focus that, all of us make mistakes, but we're whole people and we're driven by appetites, desires, aspirations, all kinds of things. So those two organizations were, very precious and important to me. And of course, I worked with lots of arts organizations, historical organizations, and other things as well. But the point is, and you can hear it in the way I'm talking, is what is the story? What is the story? What is it that people need to know?
Well,
And how does it make them feel?
listening to you, Bob, I mean, just moved by you telling the stories, And
Right.
the point is, and I think you bring it out very well, is that everybody has a story to tell.
Oh yeah.
But that's where I guess working with you come into play because it's incredible. A lot of people don't realize that. They think what they're doing is not important or that other people wouldn't care. But just two examples of you telling a brief story that they're very moved by it. I guess that's where working with you comes into play. You help them kind of find their story and then help them share it with the world.
Yeah. And refine the story one thing and another. And the thing that I've been working on recently, and I know this is one of the things that you want to talk about, is the whole some guy says thing, which is mostly stories that I'm writing on Substack, but it comes directly out of stories from the storm, from Helene, that happened here in Asheville. For the first couple of weeks after that storm hit, if we knew anything at all, it was because some guy said there's water over here. Some guy said the World Central Kitchen is over there. Some guy said I know where you can get some free Wi-Fi, and I just started collecting these stories that I put together in a program called Some Guy Says, that I've presented it now 5 times in Florida. And the reason I've taken it to Florida is because of the news cycle, you know? I know that every day I talk to somebody who has an amazing storm story that they're still living through or trying to address, and nobody seems to really be thinking about that. You know, since the storm happened, there's been an election, there have been fires in California, there have been all kinds of things. And one of the things that I've tried to do is to let people know in other places that we merit their consideration. And storytelling is a good way to do that. It's something that stays and lasts.
Yeah, I love the title too. I never thought about it, but you're absolutely right. Some guy says, where do you get information from? So when you went to Florida or this particular program, so what does it entail? You're telling stories from Asheville, you're telling stories that you heard or that somebody.
Well, yeah, I'm mostly telling stories in Nashville, and because I lived in Florida for forever, um, I have a bit of a following, and I'm very, very, very lucky because I also work and have always worked with a woman who, until recently, was the principal percussionist for the Jacksonville Symphony Orchestra. Her name is Charlotte Mabry, and Charlotte is, um, well, she's elegant and glib and hilarious, and she has plenty of stories of her own, and it has been one of the joys and pleasures of my life to be able to work with her. Um, it's funny how we came to know each other. This is a long time ago. There was a wonderful production of a Sam Shepard play, "Fool for Love," that had taken
Sure.
place.
It was a movie too, right?
Right, yeah. And Charlotte had a student, and I had a friend, same person. And she was very interested in Sam Shepard after having seen the production. So she asked me if I had any Sam Shepard scripts, and I said, well, sure. So I handed her a collection of scripts, and she found a piece for voice and percussion. And Charlotte was very, very interested in performance art, and so was I. So our mutual friend arranged for us to meet each other, and it was really a business meeting to talk about how we might present this piece. It was called Tongues Together, and from that has come this 35-year relationship. There's a great line in Fool for Love where a character says, "I can smell your thoughts before you think them," and that's how we are with each other. We are really like an old married couple in a lot of ways.
And it's just really cool that when you get into that kind of relationship or
Yeah.
friendship, to be
Yeah.
able to then maintain it, as you said, for 35 years. So some guy says then it has a life, but the beauty of it is it could be used so many different situations, not
Well,
just
exactly.
Atlanta.
Exactly.
You name it. Where do you get your information? Some guy says.
Right, exactly. And that's the name of my Substack, and we can talk about that later on too. But if anybody is interested in reading some more of the stories or some of the stories that I've published about the storm, it's real simple. You just go to Substack and you can either look for Robert Arleigh White or Some Guy Says, and it'll take you right there.
And talk if you would, Bob, because a lot of folks aren't familiar with Substack. So you mentioned that you post your stuff on this. What is Substack? Is it a
It's like a blog platform.
right? But it's a blog for anybody can be on it.
Anybody can be on it. And it's very, very, very user friendly. They give you all sorts of tools, not only to get you started and to develop an audience, but also they give you ancillary materials that you can post on your other social media platforms like, Facebook or Blue Sky Threads, LinkedIn, whatever it is.
So you're giving me an idea that I afterwards I'll pick your brain on. I might even check it out though. It's something that anybody can get on, and it's just
Absolutely.
it's a
Yeah.
written platform.
Yeah.
And so how often do you post on Substack?
I shoot for twice a month. Sometimes it's more. It's rarely less, but at least twice a month I'm up there.
Okay, good to know. So go from there then, Bob. So you're doing this. I love it, the concept of some guy says, and that it then took you further. You're now actually telling stories elsewhere too, and you're actually performing shows as you're now you become in essence a storyteller, would you say?
Oh, exactly. That when people say, "What do you do?" That's what I tell them. I'm a storyteller.
And
I'm a,
so, in terms of storytelling, do you prefer writing them or performing them?
I love performing them. I love performing them. I love connecting with an audience. Um, and the luscious thing about performing in Jacksonville is, when you're talking to people and you see a number of people that you know in the audience, half of them were either at the event that you're telling about or know of it, and you can turn to them and say, "Am I making this up?" In other words, you can draw the audience right into the story, and they're part of it too. So what I'm looking to do in Asheville are a couple of things, but also, build a high level of community affection so that people will actually want to hear these things.
Well, talk about also something else you're doing, and I have to ask you what exactly is it? And that's you also, I guess, aside from the some guy says, you also have something called Raw Talks. And
Raw Talks.
what are
And
Raw Talks?
sure, some guy says is probably a subset of Raw Talks. Raw Talks is Robert Arley White Talks and talks. And the way that came about, there's a wonderful, wonderful friend. And we used to sit together. My favorite restaurant in Jacksonville is a place called Biscotti's. And we would sit at the bar there and we would tell these stories and tell these stories. And she said, "You need to put this on stage." And I thought, "You got to be kidding me." But, you just keep thinking since that's what you're good at. And she really leaned on me. I'm not making this up for like about 2 years. And then she came to me and she said, "Listen, I've got it all figured out. We're going to call it Raw Talks." Her husband had a performance space. There was another person, Barbara Colacello, who had a performance space. They were very, very interested in having me come in and do this work. And so that's how it came to be. And with your respect to question earlier about singing and songs and stuff like that, I work in a couple of songs. So I should say very quickly, Raw Talks. The talks are raw. They certainly are. But I think they're also, well, they do what stories do. They hopefully uplift, inspire, reflect, and do all that. But so with respect to the most recent Some Guy Says, which is a raw talk, I would start off. I start off by singing Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now. Uh, Clouds up and down, love, give and take, life, win and lose. And then I look at the audience and I say, how many of you lost something in 2024? Like a job or a pet or a parent or a situation or a mountainside and then the list goes on and I have people raise their hands and I have them keep their hands up. And when everybody has a hand up or two, I'll look up and I say, "Yeah, we lost a lot, didn't we? And yet here we are. We're all together. And aren't we the luckiest?" So the first time I performed this, I was very, very fortunate. There was a sweet friend in the audience, and that's her tagline: "Aren't we the luckiest? Aren't we the luckiest?" So I was able to say, "Danielle, what is it you always say?" She said, "We are the luckiest." So I had her come up and lead the audience in a chant: "We are the luckiest. We are the luckiest." So immediately we went from this space where we were thinking and talking about loss into a space where we were celebrating being able to be together and have
By the way,
joy in one another.
I have to remember that. I just love that though. What is it? Aren't we the luckiest?
Aren't we the luckiest?
Beautiful question. I just now figured out. So Raw Talks, I get it too. It ties into somebody's initials. Isn't that kind of
Yeah,
amazing? You were lucky
exactly.
with that. Well,
Well, that's so funny that you just did that because when my friend Laura came to me and said, "We'll call it Raw Talks," I thought, "Raw Talks?" She goes, "Robert Arley White Talks." And I went, "Oh, yeah, of course. Okay."
well, that's what I was thinking when I read that. I said, boy, and when I asked you to give an example of raw talk, and I'm kind of interested in it, but it's not necessarily raw talk. It's just your initials talk. But let me put you on the spot, Bob, since we're talking about it, and I
Yeah,
asked you this off the air. Could I ask you to give, if you would, an example of a raw talk? You can give a short one. By
for
the way,
sure.
how long are they typically?
Well, some of them are good for a line or two and, as jokes or whatever, but some of them are a little bit hefty. And I thought you might ask this question, so I prepared a story. I actually printed it out in case I get lost along my way. But this is a story about a very, very stormy summer in Jacksonville. And it's been on my mind a lot, I guess, because of the storms that we had here. But we had a very, very stormy summer, and I was at work one day and I got this phone call from my mother. She was so upset. Your father has gone crazy. He's gone out of the house. He says he doesn't love me anymore, and I don't know what to do. I need you to come home right this minute. And I said, okay, I'm on my way. And as I was driving out there, Blaine, I thought to myself, my dad has a lot of things that are wrong with him, and one of those things that he can't see, and he's gone out in this rain. This can't be good. I think I need some more information. So from the car, I called back, and thankfully this time he answered the phone. And I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "Everything's fine. We don't need anybody coming over here right now." And I said, "Ah, shucks, you're too late. I'm on my way. I can't wait to see you." So I got to the house, and there they were, and in their respective corners. And I asked them to tell me what happened, and the good news is they each told essentially the same story, but it was like you have two witnesses at a car wreck, right? And she told me what it looked like from her corner, and he told me what it looked like from his corner, but it was the same wreck, right? So I listened to this, and I thought I would separate them. I said to my mother, this was very funny to me. I said to my mother, "You need to go into the den and wait there until I'm ready to talk to you," right? And and she went. I think there comes a time in life where you may find yourself talking to your parents the way parents will sometimes talk to children, and that she responded to me and did what I needed for her to do in that moment was wonderful. But the thing about my dad was the thing that I said to you earlier. He had a brilliant career in the Navy. He worked very closely with Admiral Arleigh Burke. He worked very closely with Admiral John McCain, who was Senator John McCain's father. I mean, he really had a hand in running the Navy, and he was very, very, very vulnerable in this moment. And I looked at him and I said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm doing great." I said, "Okay, how are you doing today?" And he got very, very quiet. And then he said, there are just too many things that are wrong with me that can't be fixed." And he was right. He had Parkinson's, he had diabetes, and he had this kind of macular degeneration, which is often confused with dementia, which is what it leads to. It's when your brain has to decipher the things that your eyes no longer can. And you can just sort of logically reason your way out of those situations. There's just no way that the things that you're telling yourself that you're looking at could be there. But to do this over and over and over again, day after day after day, will wear you out. And beyond a certain point, you just give into it. And you do see those things. The problem was that my mother had no patience for this. And she would say, "Robert, you know that there are no children, burglars, cats, floaty things, or whatever it is you think you see in this house." And that created some real tension between the two of them, as you might imagine. Um, anyway, I sat there with him for a long time. And in fact, I grabbed his hand and I just held on to it. I don't know that I'd ever initiated that move before, certainly not as an adult. And I didn't want to let go of his hand. We sat there together for the longest, longest time. And then I said, "Listen, let me go talk to mom." So I went into the den where she was waiting and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Oh, he just won't let me do anything." I said, "Well, what does that mean?" "Well, he won't let me do anything that I want to do." "Well, what do you want to do?" And she said, "Well, I would like to turn out the lights." And so what I was able to figure out was dad would go to bed at 8:30 and mother would sit up on the computer till 10:30 at night. I had gotten him a computer. I thought that they would enjoy it, but my dad couldn't get on it because my mother was on it all the time. And then when we got her hooked up with Facebook, that was, there was no stopping her. She, like I said earlier, we had lived all over the planet. She would look for people who had shared in our lives and adventures. She would keep up with them. And when she got tired, she would go to bed and she would wake him up and she would say, Robert, I'm going to bed now. Can I turn out the lights? And she would wake him up from a dead sleep and he would say, No, Mary, I've got to go do that. And he would stumble around the house looking for lights to turn out and then he would come back to bed. So I looked at her and I said, Well, look, did you ever think that you would just turn out the lights and go to bed? Or maybe you would turn out the lights and if you want some nighty night time with him, you could say, Robert, I turned out the lights for you tonight. And she said, I never thought of that. And I said, Well, let's go talk to him and see what he says. So we went back into the living room where he was. I said, Dad, Mom wants to ask you a question. And she said, Robert, I want to know why I can't turn out the lights. And I thought, well, that didn't sound like a question, but it's a start. And he looked at her for the longest time. And then he looked at me. And then he looked down. And then he looked at me. And he said, because he was just so very compromised, he said, If I eat anything, your mother has to make it for me. If I have to go anywhere, your mother has to take me there. Turning the lights out at night is the one and only thing that I'm able to do to show her that she is loved and cared for and safe in her home. And we all were quiet for a little bit. And then I turned to my mom and I said, Well, Mom, what do you want to say to that? And she said, Well, I guess he can turn out the lights. But it was so interesting because the picture that I have of the two of them in my mind as I was driving away later that afternoon, they were standing under the eaves of the garage in the pouring driving rain, and they reached toward each other with their inside hands, and with their other hands, they waved goodbye to me.
So that's a raw tale.
That's a raw tale.
And great tale. I'm listening to it, Bob, and what's cool about it is that even as you're telling a story, we all have these kinds of stories that we can relate to. In other words,
Yeah,
those, I'm listening to you and thinking to myself, these are my parents. My parents had some of the same kinds of behaviors and actions. And I guess what's great about the story is that I guess they never thought about it, or even your parents. They never put it together. But
right,
nobody ever asked that question, why are they doing it? They just, I guess we just do things without thinking about them.
right. I think that's true. Well, one of the things that I'm involved with right now, I got end of life care certification right before I left Florida, and now I'm working on my recertification. And to your very point, one of the things that I love about this work is capturing the stories of people who are passing, or more likely, their loved ones and caregivers, the people who are taking care of them. A lot of times, in families, there are those apocryphal stories like the one that I just told. But then there are also stories that haven't been shared yet, or maybe were only shared with one other person, or maybe among a group of siblings. Each sibling has a particular story that they remember, but these stories really need to be captured and shared among everybody. You said it earlier, everybody has a story, and everybody's life is significant. I feel silly sometimes when I talk about, well, my name is important, Robert Ollie White. Well, everybody's name is important. Everybody wants their name to be spelled correctly. Everybody wants to tell the story of their name. And so in addition to working with nonprofits, it's been one of the honors and privileges of my life also to be able to work with individuals and families, to be able to capture stories before they're gone forever.
Funny you say that, Bob, because I'm listening to you and thinking about my dad. And my dad was a great storyteller, but he never told me a lot of his stories, and I was
Right.
always the thing I was perhaps most upset he never shared, and a lot of guys are like this when he was in World War II. And
Mhm.
he told a lot of stories, but he never told one story, Bob, about his experience in the military. It's like 4 years, and I guess that a lot that happens to a lot of guys, right? Or do you hear that?
Oh, in my own family's life, my dad had a real estrangement from his own father. Um, and I didn't even know that man's name until much later in life. And I had always assumed that he had passed away long before I died, but long before I died. I had always assumed that he had passed away long before I was born. And in fact, I was born in 1956 and this man passed away in 1959. I had no idea. And it was only toward the very, very end of my father's life that I started to hear what led to the estrangement. Really, that was one of the things that was really sort of beautiful and revealing. My dad was a military guy and he had this experience in the military, but he was a very emotional person. And later on in his life, we found he was a real easy cry, which was very, very sweet. And um, and being able to understand, golly, what a complicated person. But I guess everybody is, right?
Really on the spot, Bob, you're giving me kind of an interesting question to ask here. And that is when you work with somebody or you deal with somebody, either in your family or a friend, and they don't want to share their stories, or they're very private or they listen to other stories, but how do you bring somebody out who doesn't want to share their story?
Well, I don't know that you do. You have to meet people where they are, and you create as safe a space as you possibly can. But a lot of stories go to the grave. They absolutely do. It's really interesting. I'm glad that you asked that question because an interesting piece of information is a lot of times people like my dad, um, they just will not die. My dad lived about 4 months past what we call his use by date, right? And every day we would think, please let it be today because his suffering was just too great. And there are three reasons why people just hold on. One of them is the thing that you just brought up. There's a story that's not resolved. There's a story that hasn't been shared. There's something that needs to be taken care of. Another reason people wait and hang on is because they're waiting for somebody to get there. My father's mother, as we were moving from Honolulu to Florida, she waited for him to get there before she was able to go. And then I was with my father on the day that he passed, and I walked out of the room and he died like 5 minutes later. And I thought, well, this is so typical. This is so him. He was not going to die in front of me. That was not going to happen. But people will hold on to stories. They really, really will. Things happen. Things happen.
Well, the work
And
you
a lot of
do,
stories, and I know this is true in my life. I suspect it's true of most people. There are some stories that you just bury.
well, in the work you do, Bob, let me ask you that from an individual standpoint, you can tell a story or you can write it down. Do you recommend that people write their stories down?
I recommend that people get their stories out. A lot of people are not writers, and a lot of people are not talkers. But one of the things that I do recommend is that um, people who are trying to get at somebody's story write down questions and bring along a recording device and ask people if they're okay with answering questions and being recorded and ask them, how did you meet Papaw? What was the first car you drove? What kind of a student were you? What was your first job? And see where those conversations take you. This is one of the reasons I like talking with you so much, Blaine, because I mean you're a good listener and you hear things. And I had no idea we were going to talk about some of the things that we've talked about today. And I'm glad you asked these questions. Thank you.
Well, the same thing too. I didn't I didn't know the direction we were going, but it's like so fascinating because the stories are out there.
Yeah.
But as you gave the example in the beginning with companies, but even in individuals, and so many people, I think, unfortunately, don't share their stories, or people don't know their stories, or they don't know them until it's too late. I love the idea you just gave, and it's a simple thing to do. that if you want stories to live, rather than ask them to write them down, if they won't write them down, just talk about them like we're doing now,
Mhm.
and you'll have a record of it, kind of thing, you know.
Exactly.
Um, because talk about a great gift to give to somebody, that's a very sweet way to remember somebody. Is just,
Right.
and not only that, Bob, talk about the value of this too. It's also great for both people. It's great for the listener, but it's also probably great for the person telling the story that they have somebody willing to listen to it.
Oh gosh, I can't tell you how many times um, I've talked to somebody who's relieved either to get something off of their chest or they discover for themselves that the fact of their living at their particular time in their particular way was important, made a difference, was helpful, was resourceful. Maybe there was a cautionary tale in there, but there is something in that story of their living that is so important. That is so important. And it makes people many times, it gives them the kind of confidence and the comfort and the ease that they need to pass on along. And that's essentially what the work of an end of life caregiver is somebody who helps, who works alongside of other professionals to ensure that your passing is the best that it can possibly be, that you're comfortable and at peace.
And again, that's unfortunately something else that people don't think too much about, you know.
Well, they don't. And sociologically speaking, that's a pretty recent phenomenon. I mean, up until about 100 years ago, families did this work of living and growing and dying together. And I think that was because 100 years ago, most families were agrarian. You lived on a farm, so you saw the life cycle of plants and animals and things, and it was more natural and it was more easy. And then over the course of the last 100 years, there's just been this incredible shift to urban living, and we're a little bit more isolated. We're not comfortable about talking about these kinds of things. We would prefer to think about how to keep living, how to keep accumulating, how to keep being relevant, and those kinds of things, and not really being present for what's going on. It's just so many times, suddenly you realize, oh, mother is dying. What are we going to do? And those conversations didn't used to happen. You always knew what you were going to do. You're going to do the same thing that had happened in your family for generations. But we live very differently now. And it's interesting to me that the work of end of life care is is really taken off. And I think people are starting to understand, especially in the world that we live in now, that there really are things that are very important and worth uh, touching base on and thinking about.
Bob, if somebody wants to become a storyteller, we'll put it kind of a general category. How do they go about doing it?
There are lots and lots of opportunities, I think, to work with improv groups. That's a great way, or to work with acting teachers, or I'm sure that there are storytelling coaches. I know that in Jacksonville, there were a lot, I would say three really outstanding story coaches. But the best thing that you can do is be very intentional about telling your stories to your friends and family members. And a lot of times, those people will give you the feedback that you need. Maybe not the feedback that you want, but the feedback that you need. So think about the things that happen and the things that move you or the things that amuse you, or, all of it is part of being a human being. And think about those things and be intentional about telling them as stories more than
And
just
a good friend
participating
of
in a
mine,
conversation.
a good friend of mine is sort of in that category. We meet for breakfast once a week, and I loved his stories. But what makes his stories so great, Bob, I don't know how you feel about this, but that even if I've heard them before, I love hearing them again, you know? And always, you told the story of your folks. It always used to bother me about my mother, that my father loved telling jokes and sometimes stories as well. My mother would always cut him off and say, "You've told that, 47 times, Bernie. She doesn't want to hear it again." But I loved hearing it, you know? And I guess that it's kind of an indication of a good storyteller. They tell tell a story before, and you like hearing it again, you
Yeah.
know. Um,
Yeah.
but
Oh, that's a lovely thought. That's a lovely thing.
what?
The story you just shared about your friend, that you like his stories.
Yeah, but I love them, and I've heard them, repeatedly. But it's funny, Bob, because I'll ask them or prompt them to tell me the story, or just, and I never get tired of them. But that's, I guess, a good example of a good storyteller.
Yeah.
And I'll mention, since I'll have to get him to listen to the show, but he's a good friend of mine, Tom Gallagher. We get together every morning or once a week for breakfast, and tomorrow's we're going to get together, and we tell stories. But he tells stories, and they're always good. They're
That's wonderful.
fascinating to me. But also, I guess one last thing I'll ask you, and that is in the significance of the person listening to the story. I was mentioning my mother wasn't a good listener in the sense that what about if you've heard the story before? Do you stop the person, or how do you deal with that?
You asked a question earlier about the difference between writing and
Right.
telling stories. And I think in my own case, what I've learned to do, and I've got a lot of stories about this, uh, something will happen and I'll tell somebody and a light bulb goes off. That's a really good story, or that's a story that needs some work, or that's a story. And I'll tell it to this person, and then I'll tell it, and then I'll get it to where I think it's ready to be heard in a performance. And then beyond a certain point, I'll record it and then I'll write it down. You know, I think a story, in order to be refined, whether you edit it, or tell it, it needs to be told a number of times so that you can learn where those tender spots are, where the laugh line is, where the where the arc and the direction of the thing is and how it builds. I don't think it's something that happens boom right out of the gate. I think it's something that needs to be refined and tended and polished.
And if you heard the story, final question, more than once, do you let the story go on, or do you stop the storyteller? What's your thinking on that?
Well, the good news is if you go to a storytelling events, I think they have them at Story Parlor every
Right,
third Thursday. And also there's a moth event, I want to say at, is it the Gray Eagle? I think so.
probably.
They give you a time limit, 7 minutes, 5 minutes, and they're very sweet about it. They'll wave at you when you're a minute away, and then when you've hit your time, they'll go like this, or they'll do something like that. And then, if you're really abusive with the rule, then they'll say, "We're so sorry, we have to stop you there." Um, but you, I'm going to say something obnoxious. I miss the old Twitter, where you had 240 characters to get your message across. I loved the idea of editing it down to like nothing. I'm going to tell you a great story. This will probably be the last one. But I had an opportunity to raise a whole lot of money for a theater in Florida, and I worked with a real big deal donor. This guy was very, very important to me. His name was Harold K. Smith, and he was the inventor of the Swisher Sweet cigar. He's in the Tobacco Hall of Fame. And he had made a pledge to give a whole lot of money to this theater if they could raise a whole lot of money first. So I wrote the letter that was going to go out and start off the whole campaign. And it was a real by the book letter. First you do this, then you do that. It's 2.5 pages, boom, done. And he looked at that letter and he went, "Good God, nobody's going to read this." And he just started marking it all up. And then he said, I'm going to take it home, I'm going to write it myself. And he came back with this letter that was about a half a page long. And it was the kind of letter that you did not have to read. You could look at it and get it. And it went like this: help, exclamation point, next paragraph. Sometimes, comma, you just have to ask for it, period. And then he said, "Here's what we're trying to do, and here's the part that you can play." And I mean, it really was half a page. And when you do that, you load all of that energy into that little, it's much more dynamic. And people were very responsive to that letter. That was a powerful learning experience for me, which you wouldn't tell by all the talking that I've done today.
No, it reminds me, I think it was Wrigley, the guy with the gum. I
Yeah,
think he was the guy who said that if you can't get it in one page or less, or somebody said this, don't send it. It's
right.
just half a page. Wow, pretty impressive.
Yeah,
Bob, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, either to learn more about your storytelling work or, and I know the end of life thing, fascinating
sure.
stuff, or the work with nonprofits, what's the best way to find you?
I'm going to give you three options. The probably the best way to find me is to direct message me on Facebook. I'm Robert Arleigh White on Facebook. Also, you can interact with me on Substack. If you go to substack.com and search for Some Guy Says or Robert Arleigh White, you'll find me. Some Guy Says, I think, will take you to, a bunch of stories. And I'm happy for people to have my phone number. And that number is 904-982-6425. So I'd
Yeah,
love to hear from people. I'd love to know how I can be a resource for folks in my community here in Asheville.
and you certainly are. Anyway, Bob, I'd like to thank you for being my guest on
What a
this
treat.
control
Oh,
website.
you always make it so easy and fun. Thank you.
Likewise, I'd also like I might thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti, and it's been too
Absolutely.
long, but I look forward to actually catching you up with you in person one of these years, man.
That
Thanks.
sounds great. All
Good
right,
speaking to
brother.
you.